The dust never settled in Holbrook that September afternoon, swirling like whispered secrets around the courthouse steps where Judge Morrison adjusted his spectacles and declared that today would be different. Today, a woman who had never spoken a single word would be auctioned off to the highest bidder, and every man in town knew exactly what that meant, even if the law pretended otherwise. She stood there in the amber light, hands bound loosely with rope, her mismatched eyes scanning the crowd with an intelligence that made grown men look away. One eye brown as desert earth, the other green as spring grass, and around her neck hung a leather cord bearing symbols that belonged to 3 different tribes, something that should have been impossible. Ethan Cross hadn't planned on staying in town past noon. His mare needed new shoes, nothing more, but when he heard the commotion spilling from the courthouse into the dusty street, something in his chest tightened like a fist. He'd seen that same look before, in the eyes of captured soldiers during his cavalry days, that mixture of defiance and resignation that comes when dignity meets raw power. The woman stood perfectly still as Judge Morrison read from a document that classified her as a ward of the state, found wandering without tribal affiliation, without language, without legal identity. "Gentlemen, we have a Christian duty here," Morrison announced, his voice carrying over the murmur of assembled ranchers and merchants. "This woman requires proper guidance, proper supervision. The territory recognizes that any upstanding citizen willing to assume guardianship will be providing a service to both law and humanity." The men shifted their weight, some removing their hats, others spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. Everyone understood the transaction being disguised as charity. Ethan studied the woman's face, noting the ritual scar on her left wrist, a precise pattern that seemed to tell a story in a language nobody could read. She hadn't moved during the entire proceedings, hadn't flinched when Morrison described her as a burden on public resources or when the first man stepped forward offering 2 horses and a section of grazing land. Her silence wasn't submission, Ethan realized, it was strategy. She was listening, calculating, waiting. 3 head of cattle and 50 acres, called out Clayton Hayes, the lumber mill owner whose wife had died the previous winter. The crowd murmured approval, but Morrison held up his hand, clearly expecting higher offers. The afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, and Ethan noticed how the woman's unusual eyes reflected the light, making her appear almost otherworldly despite her very human circumstances. 40 acres and 2/4 horses, countered Marcus Webb, whose reputation with hired girls was well known throughout the territory. Ethan's jaw tightened. He'd seen what men like Webb did with power, how they justified their appetites with legal documents and social conventions. The woman's gaze swept across the crowd again, pausing briefly on each speaker, memorizing faces with the careful attention of someone who understood that survival depended on knowing exactly who posed which threats. Judge Morrison consulted his pocket watch, clearly enjoying the spectacle of respected men reducing themselves to barely concealed desperation. "Do I hear any final offers? Remember, gentlemen, you're not just acquiring guardianship, you're accepting responsibility for civilizing and educating a human soul." The hypocrisy dripped from his words like honey from a broken comb, sweet on the surface but sticky with corruption underneath. Ethan stepped forward from the shadows of the general store, his boots announcing his presence on the wooden sidewalk. Every head turned toward him, surprised, because Ethan Cross was known for 2 things: keeping to himself and meaning what he said. "Judge," he called out, his voice cutting through the afternoon heat like a blade. "I'll offer my black stallion and 3 acres of creek-fed pasture." The crowd fell silent. Ethan's stallion was legendary throughout the territory, worth more than most men made in a year. Morrison's eyebrows rose with genuine surprise. "Mr. Cross, that's quite generous, but are you certain you understand the nature of this arrangement?" His tone suggested that a man who lived alone might not be suitable for such responsibilities, but his eyes betrayed his greed. The stallion represented real value, tangible wealth that could be immediately converted to cash or political favors. "I understand perfectly," Ethan replied, stepping closer to the courthouse steps. "The question is whether you do." Something in his tone made several men in the crowd shift uncomfortably, remembering stories about what Ethan Cross had done during the Indian Wars, the kind of stories that were whispered rather than spoken aloud. The silence stretched like taut wire between Ethan and Judge Morrison while the assembled crowd held its collective breath. The woman's mismatched eyes fixed on Ethan for the first time, studying him with an intensity that made him feel as though she was reading something written in his bones. Morrison cleared his throat, his greed warring with his instinct for self-preservation, because everyone in Holbrook knew that crossing Ethan Cross was like poking a sleeping mountain lion. "Very well, Mr. Cross," Morrison finally declared, his voice artificially jovial. "The territory hereby grants you legal guardianship of this ward, contingent upon your immediate transfer of the agreed-upon property." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to split the afternoon in half, creating a before and after that would ripple through the town for months to come. Ethan nodded once, his face revealing nothing, but inside his chest something loosened that had been tight for years. He approached the woman slowly, the way he might approach a wounded animal, keeping his hands visible and his movements deliberate. When he reached for the rope binding her wrists, she didn't pull away, but he felt the subtle tension in her muscles, ready to fight or flee at the first sign of betrayal. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "My name is Ethan. I mean you no harm." Her eyes searched his face with that same careful intensity, and though she didn't speak, something in her posture shifted, a microscopic relaxation that suggested she was willing to reserve judgment rather than assume the worst. The rope fell away from her wrists, revealing marks that spoke of recent captivity, but also older scars that told stories Ethan suspected no one should have to hear. She rubbed her wrists absently, her gaze never leaving his face, and he noticed that her hands moved with the precise economy of someone accustomed to making every gesture count. When she was ready, she stepped down from the courthouse platform with a grace that made the crude spectacle of the auction seem even more obscene in retrospect. Clayton Hayes approached them as they prepared to leave, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. "Cross, you might want to reconsider this arrangement," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable edge of a threat. "That woman's been nothing but trouble since they brought her in. Strange things happen around her. Livestock getting spooked, water sources drying up, children having nightmares. You sure you want that kind of curse on your land?" Ethan's hand moved instinctively to rest on his gun belt, a gesture so subtle most men would miss it, but Hayes had enough sense to recognize the warning. "Strange things happen around men who hurt women too, Clayton," Ethan replied, his tone conversational but carrying undertones that made several bystanders take involuntary steps backward. "Funny how often those men find themselves having accidents. Horses throwing them, wells going bad, tools breaking at inconvenient moments." The woman watched this exchange with obvious interest, her head tilting slightly as though she was cataloging the social dynamics, mapping the alliances and enmities that would determine how safe she might be in this new arrangement. Ethan noticed her attention and felt a strange pride that she was seeing him stand up to bullies rather than becoming one himself. Judge Morrison materialized beside them with the legal documents, his hands trembling slightly as he thrust the papers toward Ethan. "You'll need to sign these, Mr. Cross, and provide a forwarding address for any future correspondence from territorial authorities." His nervousness was palpable, suggesting that he was already regretting the transaction, perhaps wondering if Ethan knew exactly how much money had changed hands to arrange this particular auction. Ethan signed the papers with quick, decisive strokes, then handed over a deed to the creek-fed pasture, watching Morrison's eyes widen as he realized the true value of what he'd just received. "As for correspondence," Ethan said, folding the guardianship papers into his coat pocket, "you know where to find me. Same place I've been for the past 8 years." The message was clear: if anyone wanted to cause trouble, they knew exactly where to bring it. As they walked toward the livery stable where Ethan had left his wagon, the woman moved beside him with a wariness that never quite became fear. She kept her distance, but not so much that she couldn't react if he made any sudden movements, and Ethan found himself respecting her caution even as he hoped to eventually earn her trust. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the painted cliffs in the distance, casting long shadows that turned the dusty street into a canvas of light and darkness. The wagon wheels carved deep ruts in the desert sand as they left Holbrook behind, the town shrinking into a collection of dusty buildings that wavered like mirages in the heat. Ethan kept his hands loose on the reins, allowing his horses to set their own pace while he studied the woman from the corner of his eye. She sat perfectly upright on the wagon seat beside him, her unusual eyes scanning the horizon with the systematic attention of someone reading a map written in stone and sky. The painted desert stretched before them in layers of red, orange, and purple, the ancient rocks telling stories that predated any human conflict by millions of years. Ethan had always found peace in this landscape, in its indifference to human struggles, but today he wondered what the woman saw when she looked at these familiar cliffs and mesas. Her fingers traced patterns on her knee, movements so subtle they were almost invisible, but Ethan recognized the gestures of someone conducting a silent conversation with the land itself. "That's Eagle's Nest Mesa," he said quietly, pointing toward a distinctive rock formation that rose like a cathedral spire from the desert floor. "Hopi folks say it's sacred ground. Never seen anyone climb it, though I suppose it could be done." The woman's gaze followed his gesture, and for a moment her expression softened with something that might have been recognition or longing. She didn't speak, but she nodded once, a brief acknowledgement that suggested his words had meaning for her. As the afternoon progressed, Ethan noticed subtle changes in her demeanor. When a hawk circled overhead, she watched its flight pattern with obvious knowledge, her head moving to track its hunting behavior. When they passed a cluster of barrel cacti, she gestured toward them with raised eyebrows, and Ethan realized she was asking a question. "Water," he confirmed, understanding her meaning. "Cut one open, you can drink for days. Tastes like hell, but it'll keep you alive." She smiled then, just a ghost of expression that transformed her entire face. The sun was beginning its descent when they encountered their first real challenge. Marcus Webb and two other men waited at the crossroads where the main trail split toward Ethan's ranch, their horses positioned to block the path. Webb's face was flushed with whiskey and wounded pride, his hand resting conspicuously on his pistol grip. "Cross," he called out as the wagon approached. "Seems like you might be having second thoughts about that arrangement back in town." Ethan brought the wagon to a slow stop, his body language remaining relaxed even as his mind calculated distances and angles. The woman beside him went absolutely still, but he could feel the coiled tension in her muscles, like a spring compressed to its limit. "Can't say that I am, Marcus," Ethan replied evenly. "Road's big enough for all of us, though. No need for anyone to get in anyone else's way." "See, that's where you're wrong," Webb continued, his voice thick with alcohol and entitlement. "That woman represents a business opportunity that you interfered with. Some of us invested considerable time and resources preparing for that auction, and we don't appreciate having our investments disrupted by a hermit with too much money and too little sense." The woman's hand moved slightly, drawing Ethan's attention to her wrist where the ritual scar caught the late afternoon light. For the first time since leaving town, she spoke, but not in English or any native language Ethan recognized. The words flowed like water over stone, musical and precise, and though he couldn't understand their meaning, their effect on Webb was immediate and unsettling. The man's face went pale, and his horse began to dance nervously beneath him. "What did she say?" Webb demanded, his voice cracking slightly. The other men exchanged glances, their earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew. "What kind of curse is she putting on us?" One of them actually crossed himself, despite the obvious impossibility of the woman's words carrying any supernatural power. Ethan seized the moment of confusion, his voice cutting through their superstition like a blade through silk. "She said you're blocking her path home," he lied smoothly, "and that men who stand between a woman and her home tend to find themselves lost in places they thought they knew." It wasn't true, but it didn't need to be. Fear had already done the work that truth couldn't accomplish. The woman looked at Ethan with surprise and something that might have been approval, recognizing both his deception and his protection. Webb's horse continued to sidestep, responding to its rider's nervousness, and after a long moment of tense silence, the three men spurred their mounts aside, clearing the path but not retreating entirely. Ethan's ranch appeared in the distance like an oasis of order carved from the endless desert, weathered buildings that spoke of a man who understood the value of permanence in a land that constantly shifted. The woman straightened in the wagon's seat as they approached, her mismatched eyes taking in every detail: the sturdy corral where horses moved like liquid shadows, the well-maintained fences that spoke of careful stewardship, the small cabin that sat in harmony with the landscape rather than imposing upon it. As Ethan unhitched the horses, she wandered toward the corral where his remaining stallion watched her approach with intelligent curiosity. When she extended her hand, the animal moved toward her without hesitation, pressing his muzzle against her palm in a gesture of immediate trust that took Ethan's breath away. In 8 years of ownership, that horse had never allowed anyone but Ethan to touch him, yet here he stood, calm as a lake at dawn, accepting her presence as though she'd been caring for him all his life. "He knows you," Ethan said softly, approaching with slow steps. "Don't know how, but he knows you." The woman turned to face him, and for the first time since the courthouse, she seemed ready to bridge the silence that had defined her existence. Her hand remained on the stallion's neck, drawing strength from the connection, and when she spoke, her words came in clear, accented English that carried the cadence of someone who had learned the language by listening rather than speaking. "My name is Naira," she said, her voice rusty from disuse but unmistakably her own. "It means the one who shines like water in the old language, though I haven't spoken it aloud in 3 winters." The revelation hung between them like morning mist, fragile and precious, and Ethan understood that she was offering him something more valuable than words. She was offering him trust. 3 winters, he repeated carefully, respecting the weight of her confession. "That's when they captured you." She nodded, her fingers tracing patterns in the stallion's mane, and Ethan noticed that the horse remained perfectly still, as though he understood the importance of the moment. "My people called me the Bridge Walker," Naira continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Born between tribes, raised by 3 grandmothers who each taught me different ways of seeing the world. The scars, the symbols, the silence, they were my protection when the soldiers came. If I had no words, I had no secrets to betray. If I had no tribe, I had no people to endanger." The pieces fell into place like stones settling into a riverbed, and Ethan understood why no one had been able to identify her origins. She belonged to all tribes and none, a living bridge between worlds that no longer existed in the same way they once had. "And now," he asked gently, "what do you see when you look at this place?" Naira released the stallion and turned to face the ranch fully, her gaze sweeping across the buildings, the corrals, the endless horizon beyond. "I see a man who gave up his most precious possession to protect a stranger," she said. "I see land that remembers what it was before boundaries were drawn across it. I see possibility." Her words carried the weight of careful observation, of someone who had spent 3 years learning to read men's intentions in their smallest gestures. The sun touched the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, and Ethan realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. 2 people who had learned to survive alone, discovering that survival might take different forms when shared with someone who understood the true cost of freedom. "The men who followed us," Naira said, glancing back toward the trail. "They'll return. Men like that always do." There was no fear in her voice, only pragmatic acknowledgement of reality, and Ethan found himself nodding in agreement. "They will," he confirmed. "But they'll find us ready." The words hung in the air between them, an unspoken agreement that whatever came next, they would face it together. Naira smiled then, the first genuine expression of happiness he'd seen from her, and the transformation was remarkable. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they stood side by side, 2 people who had found their way to each other through circumstances that should have destroyed them instead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, they had found something rarer than gold in the desert. They had found home. Did you love this complete story? Hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating tales from the American West. Which part moved you the most? Drop your comment below. Want to see more stories about Naira and Ethan's journey together? Share this video with your friends.